In 1989, Buckhelm, a longshoreman from Weaverville, California, found himself traveling through Oakland on what seemed to be an otherwise ordinary evening. He was driving his compact car along the Cypress Street Viaduct, a double-decker section of Interstate 880. At that time, the viaduct was a major artery for commuters, carrying thousands of vehicles every day through the busy San Francisco Bay Area. Shortly after 5 p.m., a sudden and violent seismic event struck Northern California. The earthquake, later measured at a magnitude of 6.9, would soon be known as a Loma Prieta earthquake. The force of the quake was catastrophic. Across the Bay Area, roads split open, buildings collapsed, fires ignited, and entire sections of elevated highways were reduced to rubble. The Cypress Street Viaduct, which was built in the 1950s using outdated construction methods, suffered a devastating failure. Its upper deck pancaked onto the lower level, crushing vehicles and trapping dozens of motorists. Helm's vehicle was one of those trapped between the collapsed layers of concrete and steel. As the structure folded in on itself, he was caught in the wreckage with barely enough space to move. Emergency crews arrived on the scene and began rescue operations, but the scale of the destruction made progress painstakingly slow and dangerous. Tons of broken concrete and twisted rebar created a treacherous environment, with the risk of further collapse hampering efforts. For several days, workers picked through the ruins methodically, using cranes, jackhammers, and their bare hands when necessary. Search dogs were deployed to locate survivors, and thermal imaging devices were used to detect body heat under the wreckage. Still, the prospects of finding anyone alive diminished with each hour. Most rescues occur within the first 24 hours after the quake. Beyond that, survival rates dropped dramatically. On October 21st, nearly 4 full days after the earthquake, rescuers discovered signs of life deep within the wreckage. A California Department of Transportation engineer, while inspecting a section of the collapsed freeway, noticed slight movement inside a crushed vehicle. Rescue teams sprang into action, carefully cutting through the debris to reach the source. Inside a mangled blue compact car, they found Buckhelm alive. Despite being pinned in a confined space for approximately 90 hours, Helm was responsive. His survival was considered extraordinary given the conditions. He was immediately extracted and transported by ambulance to Kaiser Permanente Medical Center in Oakland. Upon arrival, medical staff found that he was severely dehydrated, suffering from crushed injuries, and significant damage to his lungs, kidneys, and other organs resulting from the prolonged entrapment. Crush syndrome, a condition where prolonged compression of muscle tissue leads to the release of toxins into the bloodstream, was a primary concern. See, now when pressure is suddenly relieved after hours or days of entrapment, the trapped muscles release large quantities of potassium, lactic acid, and other toxic substances, and these toxins can cause severe kidney failure and systemic shock. Buckhelm's muscles had been compressed for nearly 4 days without adequate blood circulation, making his internal environment toxic the moment blood flow resumed. Doctors placed Helm in the intensive care unit, where he was given aggressive medical treatment. This included intravenous fluids to flush out toxins, mechanical ventilation to assist his breathing, and dialysis to support his failing kidneys. Initially, there was cautious optimism. News outlets reported on his survival as a beacon of hope amid the widespread devastation of the earthquake, and he quickly earned the name Lucky Buck in the media. However, the trauma that Helm had endured was profound and unforgiving. While initial stabilization was achieved, the damage inside his body was extensive. Prolonged hypoperfusion, the lack of oxygenated blood flow to critical tissues, had caused irreversible cellular damage in many organs. His muscles were worsening, his kidneys were struggling to clear the overwhelming flood of breakdown products, and his lungs, heavily contaminated by dust and debris from the collapse, were unable to properly exchange oxygen even with mechanical support. And because of all that, complications developed rapidly. Infections took hold, specifically pneumonia, as bacteria entered the bloodstream and lungs weakened by trauma. Sepsis, a life-threatening condition caused by the body's response to infection, led to further instability. His immune system, already compromised by the shock and physical trauma, was unable to mount an effective defense. Multi-organ failure followed. Helm's respiratory failure worsened as fluid accumulated in the lungs, preventing oxygen from reaching the bloodstream even with ventilatory support. His kidneys, taxed beyond repair, ceased functioning. The heart, already burdened by electrolyte imbalances and toxic metabolites circulating through his blood, began to fail under the stress. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, including aggressive fluid resuscitation, antibiotic therapies, and continuous mechanical ventilation, his body's systems progressively shut down. Respiratory failure advanced to full cardiac failure as oxygen levels fell too low to sustain organ function. And on November 18, 1981, 28 days after his dramatic rescue, Buck Helm passed away in the hospital. The immediate cause of death was listed as respiratory failure secondary to multi-organ dysfunction caused by prolonged crush injury and systemic infection. Isan Bol, a 3-year-old from Oldham, Greater Manchester, was playing inside his home alongside his brother Ian, who was 7, in the autumn of 2016. Their playtime was lively and familiar, with the room being scattered with toys of all sorts. Nothing out of the ordinary, until at some point during the morning, the atmosphere shifted. Family members nearby noticed that Isan had suddenly become distressed. What had been a moment of play turned into a scene of growing concern. Isan was no longer laughing or speaking. Instead, he appeared panicked, his breath strained. Recognizing immediately that something was wrong, the family sprang into action. Emergency services were contacted at once. The call was placed to the Northwest Ambulance Service, and within minutes, paramedics were dispatched to the home. While waiting, the family attempted to assist Isan themselves, but his condition continued to worsen. He was struggling to breathe and his level of consciousness began to falter. When the paramedics arrived, they immediately assessed the situation and began emergency intervention. The crew initiated life-saving measures aimed at restoring normal breathing. Given the signs of airway obstruction, the team employed various standard procedures to attempt to relieve the issue. Techniques such as back blows and abdominal thrusts were applied in rapid succession. Oxygen was administered to stabilize him, and suction equipment was prepared to assist in clearing any blockage. Despite their efforts at the scene, it became clear that Isan needed hospital care urgently. He was transported with high priority to Royal Oldham Hospital. During the journey, paramedics continued advanced resuscitation measures, fighting to maintain oxygen flow and cardiac activity. Upon arrival, the hospital's emergency team took over, deploying additional emergency equipment and techniques in a bid to stabilize the young boy. Doctors at the hospital worked relentlessly. Isan was placed under extensive care protocols with continuous monitoring and intervention. Imaging studies and direct visual examination soon revealed the source of the crisis. Lodged deep within his airway was a small object, a piece from a toy set, narrow and arrow-shaped, a Lego, leading to severe hypoxia. By the time Isan arrived at the hospital, the prolonged lack of oxygen had already triggered catastrophic systemic failure. With the airway completely blocked, his lungs were unable to oxygenate his blood, causing a rapid and dangerous drop in oxygen saturation. Within less than 2 minutes of obstruction, the brain would have begun experiencing acute hypoxia, leading to confusion, unconsciousness, and irreversible damage to brain cells. As hypoxia persisted, multiple organs began to fail. The heart, deprived of oxygen, struggled to maintain rhythm, eventually worsening into cardiac arrest. Blood pressure collapsed as the heart could no longer circulate blood effectively. Organs, such as the kidneys and liver, highly sensitive to oxygen loss, began suffering tissue death within minutes. The brain, lacking oxygen and blood supply, started to swell, a process known as cerebral edema, causing further pressure and irreversible injury. Brainstem function, responsible for automatic breathing and heart rate regulation, would have ceased shortly after unconsciousness set in. Despite aggressive interventions including advanced airway management, oxygen administration, chest compressions, and pharmaceutical attempts to restore cardiac activity, the prolonged hypoxic state made survival impossible. Isan's body had already passed the point of viable recovery by the time he reached definitive care. The official medical cause of death was recorded as asphyxiation. In the days that followed, an inquest was opened at Haywood's Coroner's Court to review the circumstances of the death. Witness statements from family members, paramedics, and hospital staff were taken. The Coroner's Court learned that during play with his brother, a small Lego piece had become involved, one that, due to its shape and size, presented a significant choking risk. The investigation confirmed that no party had acted negligently. The toys present in the home were typical for children's play, and supervision had been consistent with what would be expected in a household with young children. There was no prior indication that the Lego piece would cause danger during normal use, specifically among children of school age. However, Isan, being just 3 years old, was in an age group specifically vulnerable to incidents involving small objects. Inessa Polenko arrived in Abkhazia in the spring of 2024, part of a personal trip that blended leisure with the pursuit of new experiences. At 39 years old, she had built a career as a beautification and had also become a recognized presence online, maintaining a growing following through her posts on travel, beauty, and lifestyle. Those who followed her were familiar with the polished photographs and scenic locations she frequently shared. Among the many sites in Abkhazia, the Gregory viewing platform is one of the most popular. Elevated hundreds of feet above the sea, it provides sweeping views of the shoreline, the distant horizon, and the cliffs dropping sharply into the water. Visitors come to stand at the railings, take photographs, and appreciate the natural beauty of the region. Protective barriers are in place at these sites, installed as a precaution to separate tourists from the unstable edges and sheer drops that characterize the cliffs. Polenko visited the Gregory viewpoint on a clear day, accompanied by a friend. Accounts from others present describe a relaxed atmosphere. Tourists move casually about the platform, some taking photos, others simply looking out over the sea. The barriers, although clearly marked, were occasionally crossed by visitors seeking a more dramatic angle for their photographs, a practice that authorities had previously discouraged, but which remained difficult to police fully. At some point during her time at the site, Polenko moved beyond the designated safety zone. She crossed past the protective railing and approached an area closer to the cliff's edge. Witnesses later recalled that she did so carefully, but the ground under her was uneven, composed of loose rocks and soil. These coastal cliffs, shaped by centuries of erosion and weathering, are often unstable, even when they appear solid from a distance. Polenko was seen preparing to capture a photograph. It was not uncommon for visitors at this location to want images showing the dramatic drop behind them or the expanse of the Black Sea stretching endlessly into the distance. She was holding her phone and setting her position when, without warning, her footing gave away. Observers described a sudden shift, a slip or stumble that left no time for recovery. The terrain, offering little stability, contributed to the loss of balance. In a matter of moments, Polenko went off the edge of the cliff. The drop from the viewing point to the rocky shoreline measured approximately 170 feet. Given the height, her fall would have reached an estimated speed of 60 to 75 miles per hour before impact. Witnesses described the fall as sudden and irreversible. Upon hitting the rocky shore below, Polenko suffered catastrophic injuries consistent with high-velocity blunt force trauma. These likely included multiple fractures to the skull, spine, ribs, and pelvis, as well as massive internal injuries to vital organs. Medical literature indicates that falls from this height onto hard surfaces often result in immediate or near immediate fatal disruption of the brain, heart, and major blood vessels. First responders would later confirm that she sustained injuries described as unsurvivable. Emergency services were contacted immediately by nearby witnesses. Local rescue teams responded to the call and made their way down to the base of the cliff, a task made difficult by the rugged terrain and lack of direct road access. Transporting medical equipment to the impact site required additional time and effort. Paramedics would eventually locate Polenko on the rocky shore and initiate emergency care procedures, including CPR and advanced trauma interventions. But despite rapid response and aggressive resuscitation attempts at the scene, her conditions were critical. She was transported to a nearby hospital for further treatment, but the extent of her injuries left medical teams without no viable options for recovery. Life-saving efforts were eventually ceased once it was determined that the trauma sustained was incompatible with survival. Following her death, local authorities launched a standard investigation to confirm the circumstances. It was later determined that the area where the incident occurred was properly marked with barriers and signage, and that Polenko had crossed into an unsafe zone of her own choice. Officials reiterated warnings to tourists about the dangers of moving beyond protected areas and natural landmarks, especially those involving cliffs where ground stability cannot be guaranteed. In May 2022, Deputy Robert Adam Howard was engaged in his normal law enforcement duties for the Harris County Sheriff's Office in Texas. At 27 years old, he had been with the department since 2019, serving specifically in the Violent Gain Suppression Unit. His assignment on that particular day involved the transportation of important evidence connected to an ongoing criminal case. Moving evidence between facilities or secured locations is considered a routine but critical task in the course of police work. Deputy Howard was operating a marked patrol vehicle along State Highway 249, a major roadway in northwest Harris County. The highway, known locally as Tombow Parkway, is a heavily trafficked route, specifically in the early afternoon hours when vehicles from commercial, personal, and law enforcement sectors are frequently on the move. Weather conditions that day were reported as clear and visibility was good. Now at approximately 2 p.m., while traveling northbound near the interchange with Spring Cypress Road, Deputy Howard's vehicle approached an area where an 18-wheeler was parked on the inside shoulder of the highway. The truck was stationary at the time, and that's according to later observations from investigators and eyewitness reports. For reasons that remain unclear, Deputy Howard's patrol unit began to veer slightly to the left. The motion was subtle at first, barely seeable to trailing drivers. There was no sign of sudden braking or evasive maneuvering. Within moments, however, the vehicle crossed onto the inside shoulder and collided at full speed with the rear of the stationary 18-wheeler, and the impact was devastating. The force of the crash drove the front of the patrol vehicle beneath the trailer of the 18-wheeler, creating a violent underride collision. Due to the height disparity between the two vehicles, the front of the patrol unit was crushed almost entirely, folded in on itself, and nearly split in half. The sheer violence of the impact destroyed the driver's compartment. Witnesses described the sound as an explosion, a sudden, sickening burst of twisting metal. Debris was ejected across multiple lanes, and the wreckage was so severe that parts of the vehicle, as coming from a patrol unit. First responders were dispatched immediately. Harris County Sheriff's deputies, fire crews, and paramedics arrived within minutes, but what they encountered was a horrifying scene of destruction. The patrol vehicle's front end had been obliterated, and Deputy Howard was trapped inside what could only be described as a mangled shell of steel and shattered glass. The damage was so extensive that emergency crews were forced to cut through twisted wreckage for an extended period of time just to reach him. Once extracted, Deputy Howard was rushed to Memorial Hermann Hospital in the Woodlands, a trauma center equipped for critical emergencies. Doctors initiated life-saving measures, trauma protocols, surgical evaluations, and intensive intervention. But despite their best efforts, his injuries were simply too catastrophic, and he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. A full investigation followed. Accident reconstruction specialists arrived on scene alongside Harris County investigators to begin determining how and why the crash had occurred. The entire section of the highway was cordoned off as investigators documented every detail of vehicle positions, debris patterns, roadway conditions, and any physical evidence that might shed light on the event. They noted the absence of skid marks, confirming that no braking or evasive attempt had been made, and the patrol unit had struck the truck at full highway speed, which is usually around 70 to 80 miles per hour. Investigators reviewed traffic camera footage, interviewed witnesses, and conducted mechanical inspections of the patrol vehicle. But no mechanical faults were identified. The vehicle's systems were intact and operational. Toxicology screenings found no evidence of drugs or alcohol, and there were no indications of distraction from external sources or forced maneuvers. Investigations were left with possibilities rather than answers: a momentary lapse in attention, extreme fatigue, or the onset of a medical emergency. Despite an investigation, no conclusive cause could be determined. The official findings remained open-ended, resting on theories rather than definitive explanations. If the police did find a conclusive cause, they never released it to the public, as I couldn't find anything else on this case. Following protocol, a formal procession was arranged to transport Deputy Howard's body from the hospital to the Montgomery County Forensic Services Center in Conroe. Funeral services were held several days later at the community of Faith Church in Hockley, Texas. Hundreds gathered, officers from across the state, family, friends, and those who had never met him but felt the loss. Deputy Robert Adam Howard left behind a wife and 2 young children. In the afternoon of late January in 2018, a 48-year-old man arrived at the Capilano River in North Vancouver, British Columbia, with a kayak, intending, to kayak the river. The man was quite experienced, having been kayaking since he was in his early 20s. With this experience, he also came well prepared with his equipment, bringing a helmet, cold water gear, and a personal flotation device. This experience would also make him overconfident to the fact that you shouldn't kayak alone, especially when British Columbia's lower mainland was experiencing an insane amount of heavy rainfall. The Capilano River is already known for its fast current and fluctuating water levels, and they swell beyond seasonal norms due to the runoff. And on this day, the river was dangerously high. It measured around 4.5 meters deep, with an estimated flow rate of 500 cubic meters per second, more than 15 times its usual volume. Not only that, the water was dark, visibility along the banks was poor, and the current was violent and unpredictable with a bunch of submerged logs and debris. So going kayaking alone was quite dumb, and yet he still went. At around 3 p.m. a witness saw him launching his kayak into the water, so he started kayaking, and at first, to his credit, he was doing fine, until he wasn't. No one witnessed the exact moment, but at some point he became separated from his kayak. As I said, no one witnessed the exact moment, so you can't really definitively say what happened, but what most likely happened was he hit a submerged object, which isn't unlikely given the conditions of the river. Or he was pulled into a hydraulic. Now if you don't know what that is, it's a type of reversing current that can flip and trap kayakers unexpectedly. And like I said, given the conditions of the river, with the high water volume, this greatly increases the risk of hydraulics forming. But nevertheless, because of the loss of the kayak, he lost flotation, meaning he lost any real chance to resist the river's force, and because of that, the man was quickly swept downstream. The river was extremely cold, which would have caused his muscles to weaken quite fast, and his breathing would have become impaired. Fortunate for him, witnesses did see him from either walking near the Capilano River, likely along trails or viewpoints near the Capilano Suspension Bridge area or the Kalini Park, both of which are accessible to pedestrians in overlooked sections of the river, but it's not clearly stated. When they saw him alone in the river with no kayak, they called emergency services. Multiple agencies responded to the scene, including the North Vancouver and the West Vancouver Fire Departments, the RCMP, the Canadian Coast Guard, and North Shore Rescue. A Coast Guard hovercraft was deployed to aid the search, and Talon helicopters provided aerial support. Since this is a fast-moving river and it took time for these emergency services to arrive and deploy, the place where the witnesses said he was no longer there. But after some time, the kayak of the man's was found downstream near Ambleside, but he was still missing. Daylight started to fade, and the rescuers started to lose hope of finding him alive, or at all, until the helicopter crew spotted a body lodged in a logjam near Kalini Park. He had been pinned against a mass of tree trunks and debris under approximately 1 foot of fast-moving water. Because of the river's speed and instability, recovery teams deemed it too dangerous to retrieve the body that night. So, by morning, the river's water level had dropped significantly, and a swift water rescue team was able to safely approach the log jam. They recovered the man's body, still pinned and face down. Medical examination determined that he had died from drowning, but other contributing factors were likely involved. He may have suffered blunt force trauma during the fall or while being carried downstream. Positional asphyxiation, in which a person's body is trapped in a position that restricts their breathing even if they are not fully submerged, was also a probable cause. His exact time of death was unknown, but officials believe it occurred within minutes of his separation from the kayak. Authorities later confirmed that he had entered the river alone and emphasized the extreme danger of solo kayaking, especially in high flow conditions. Peter High, a search manager with North Shore Rescue, stated publicly that attempting such a river alone was not a wise decision, no matter one's level of experience. The incident was ultimately ruled an accidental death, but it served as a warning to the outdoor community. Rigoberto Canos Ramos was working on a construction site in March 2022. He and his team were working on a major residential development in the Northwest Valley of Las Vegas. This was a large project, so this involved a lot of subcontractors and teams responsible for everything, from foundation work to underground utility installation. One such task involved digging and reinforcing trenches, long, narrow excavations used for laying pipes, conduits, and utility lines. This task would be assigned to Ramos, as he was experienced in excavation support and trench preparation. So Ramos was working with the team to prepare a trench for a scheduled concrete pour. See, these trenches need to be dug several feet to house these underground utility lines, or they run the risk of exposure to surface damage, like a large vehicle might run over them and significantly damage them, so they had to be dug a few feet. And because of that, OSHA requires that these trenches have to have certain protective equipment in them so they are safe for workers. An example would be like a trench box, a steel or aluminum box placed inside a trench. It has two large, flat side walls connected by cross supports or spreaders to hold the walls apart. Workers do their job inside the box, not the trench walls, so if the dirt does cave in, the trench box takes the hit and not the workers. They could also have a shoring system, which supports the trench walls using hydraulic jacks, beams, posts, or timber or metal sheeting. It's installed against the trench walls to actively hold back the soil and adjust it to fit the trench as it's dug. Think of it as propping up weak walls to keep them from falling. The problem is these safety systems were not being used inside this trench that was most likely 5 to 8 feet deep. And at the last minute, Ramos had entered this basically 5 to 8 foot deep hole to assist with equipment and some last minute checks to make sure everything was fine. See, it's not really exactly clear on what happened next, but without warning, a portion of the dirt walls gave away. Thousands of pounds of compacted soil collapsed into the space where Ramos was working, completely burying him beneath roughly 5 feet of dirt. The collapse was instant, giving Ramos no chance to escape or crawl out. My best guess is that since this is a construction site, it's gonna have large vehicles everywhere, and most likely one of these was near this trench. And again, if I were to guess, the nearby vehicle activity, specifically their vibrations and the weight of the machinery, may have contributed to the destabilization of the soil. And since these dirt walls can look stable while actually being vulnerable to sudden collapse, Ramos probably didn't even realize what was going on until it was too late. Ramos was basically buried alive by an insane amount of dirt. To understand the severity of this, just 1 cubic yard of soil can weigh over 3,000 pounds, heavier than a compact car. So if you do the math, since the trench was 6 feet long, you times that by 2.5 feet wide, times it by 5 feet deep, and that would equal to 75 cubic feet. Convert cubic feet to cubic inches, and there are 1,728 cubic inches in 1 cubic foot. So 75 cubic feet times 1,728 cubic inches, that would be 129,600 cubic inches. That's roughly the equivalent of over 47 wheelbarrows of compacted dirt, crushing him in place. The force of the collapse likely crushed his chest instantly, compressing his lungs and cutting off oxygen. It would have been nearly impossible to take a single breath. And to make it even worse, no one noticed at first. It was only after a short time, when his coworkers realized he hadn't reappeared, that they began to worry. Someone likely called out to him. No answer, then came the panic. Clearly realizing something was wrong, they ran over to the trench, but it was partially caved in, an obvious very bad sign. Realizing he was underneath, they began to dig, first by hand, then with tools, then with an excavator. But by the time they reached him, it was far too late. The sheer weight of the soil suffocates a person within minutes, can crush ribs, rupture organs, or paralyze breathing instantly. And since they didn't immediately realize what had happened, he was far too gone. He probably died within the first few minutes with him trying to breathe in air, but the only thing he breathed in was dirt. Emergency services arrived on scene after being called, but they couldn't really do anything as he was already dead. After recovering his body, the Nevada Occupational Safety and Health Administration launched an investigation into the circumstances of the collapse. They quickly found that the worksite had failed to use any trench protective system, which is a direct violation of federal safety standards. Protective systems such as the trench boxes or hydraulic shoring are required by law when trenches exceed 5 feet in depth unless the soil was classified as solid rock, which was not the case here. Because of that, this would lead to Ramos' family filing a wrongful death lawsuit against both KB Home Nevada, the general contractor overseeing the site, and Customized Safety and Quality Solutions, a safety consulting firm allegedly responsible for oversight. The lawsuit alleged gross negligence, arguing that the collapse and death were completely preventable had OSHA mandated safety precautions been followed. As of now, there is no public record indicating that the wrongful death lawsuit was ever resolved. The case may still be pending in the Clark County District Court, or could have been settled privately without public disclosure, but my best guess is they probably won, as given the outrageous conditions of what happened. On a damp late winter afternoon in Washington, 50-year-old Roy Messenger, a resident of nearby Alma, was driving along a rural stretch of road in his pickup truck. It's not known why he was driving, but at some point his car left the road. This is also not known why, although the conditions were typical for western Washington in February. Overcast skies, soft roadside shoulders, and damp ground, so this may explain it. But when his car left the road, it crashed into a utility pole, a wooden structure that supports high voltage power lines. The crash wasn't a horrible crash, which meant Roy wasn't seriously hurt. So, Roy, possibly dazed, got out of his car and looked around. See, the utility pole was next to a ditch, and when Roy's car hit the pole, the pickup truck ended up rolling into the ditch, just enough to where the truck couldn't be moved out unless helped by another vehicle. Roy, realizing this, pulled out his phone and called a few of his family members to help pull out the truck. The family members said yes and said they'll arrive in a bit. So Roy, now more calmer, started to relax, as now everything was going to be okay. While waiting for assistance, Roy felt something, an urge. He needed to pee, and since he was basically in the middle of nowhere, he decided to pee in the ditch near his truck. He thought nothing of it, so he unzipped his pants zipper and started to relieve himself. But this is where he made the biggest mistake of his life. Unbeknownst to him, the impact of his truck hitting the pole actually brought down one of the power lines, which actually electrified the ditch that contained shallow water and wet soil. His stream of urine, while not a solid beam, formed a continuous flow of conductive fluid. Though urine is not a perfect conductor, over a short distance, especially if the person is standing close to the energized source, it can allow electricity to travel back up the stream and into the body. In this case, the result was immediate and fatal electrocution. Basically, Roy peed into the ditch where the energized environment sent an electrical current up the stream, into you-know-what, and then up to the rest of his body. Once the current entered through his lower body, it traveled through his vital organs. Electricity disrupts the heart's rhythm instantly. It can cause the heart to stop beating or force it into fatal fibrillation. It can also damage nerves and muscles in a fraction of a second. In Roy's case, death was nearly instant. Since Roy was probably a little dazed, he didn't realize that a wire was downed. The wire was likely hidden in the grass or lying silently in shallow water, and it probably gave no visible warning of its danger, so Roy had no reason to think the ditch was deadly, just muddy and inconvenient. Some people do think Roy might have been drunk, which could explain everything, but since there is no credible source saying it, I'm going to guess this wasn't the case. When Messenger's family arrived a short time later, they found him lying dead near the ditch. Emergency services were called to the scene. Upon examination, authorities found burn marks on his body, consistent with a high voltage shock, and determined that the electrical current had entered through the lower part of his body, likely via the urine stream, and traveled through his core. The official cause of death was listed as electrocution, a result of accidental contact with an energized environment following a vehicle collision. Though it sounds bizarre, and since it does, the sources that I used will be in the description down below. This type of incident, while rare, is physically possible and consistent with established electrical safety knowledge. Electricity always seeks a path to the ground, and human bodies can become that pathway if a continuous connection is formed with a source. The moist environment, energized ditch water, and proximity to the downed wire all combine to create a deadly situation. And unfortunately for Roy, this rare, practically bizarre 1 in a million case happened to him. In the summer of 2017, deep in the southernmost reaches of Tasmania, a group of young men set out on a camping trip near Cockle Creek, a remote forested area surrounded by cold ocean air and vast wilderness. Among them was Brandon Lewis Fletcher, a 21-year-old local from Tasmania. The trip was more than just an escape, it was a celebration. Brandon had just turned 21, and this camping trip was meant to mark the beginning of adulthood with friends, drinks, laughter, and a fire. The group had settled in comfortably. After pitching tents and settling their gear, they turned their attention to an essential task: gathering firewood. With no store or nearby facilities, they decided to fell a nearby tree for fuel. It was tall, brittle, and dry, its bark peeling, trunk hollowed in places. To many, it might have looked easy to handle. Someone in the group had brought a chainsaw, and they began cutting. The chainsaw became wedged deep in the tree, struck between brittle fibers and internal knots. The saw wouldn't budge, even with effort, and tension began building, not just in the tree but among the group. Rather than abandon the cut or seek help, they devised a plan to force the tree down. They fetched a 4-wheel drive UTE and attached a recovery strap from the vehicle's tow point to the half-cut tree. The idea was to use the raw vehicle's force to bring down the tree, and hopefully free the chainsaw in the process. It wasn't the first time someone had tried this in the bush, but it was a gamble. Braden stood behind the UTE, near the tension strap within clear reach of the tree's base. He may have been directing the process, watching to see if the saw would break free or the tree would budge. As the engine revved and the strap pulled tight, the tree began to shift. Subtle cracks and pops echoed through the clearing, and then it happened. With a sudden, violent snap, the entire tree lunged downward, not in the controlled direction they had hoped for, but in a sharp, unpredictable twist. The strap had shifted the tree's center, and the rotted trunk gave way in a split-second collapse. So the full weight of the tree, hundreds of kilograms, came crashing down directly onto Braden. The impact was massive and immediate. The trunk struck his head, neck, and upper torso with brutal force. There was absolutely no chance to run, no time to dodge, just a deafening crack and a blur of motion. Witnesses described the sound as a bone-splitting thud, followed by silence. Braden's skull was crushed on impact, the tree shattering the top of his head and likely fracturing his cervical spine instantly. According to responders and later autopsy results, his brain suffered catastrophic trauma and multiple vertebrae were obliterated. His chest collapsed beneath the weight, with ribs snapping inward and piercing organs. Blood pooled rapidly beneath him in the dirt. Friends rushed to his side, screaming his name, but his body didn't move. His eyes were still open but unresponsive. There was no pulse, no breathing, only the sight of a young man minutes earlier laughing and celebrating, now lying broken beneath a tree. They tried calling for help, but Cockle Creek is isolated, and so reception was limited or non-existent. Some ran or drove to higher ground to contact emergency services, but by the time medics arrived, it was far too late. Braden was declared dead at the scene. The aftermath was devastating. The coroner, Simon Cooper, investigated the incident and ruled the death entirely avoidable. He stated plainly that the use of a vehicle to pull down a dead tree by a jammed chainsaw created an extremely hazardous and uncontrollable situation. In his report, the coroner noted that being struck by a fallen tree, not chainsaw cuts, is a leading cause of tree falling deaths in Tasmania. Most of these involved misjudged direction, decay, or makeshift methods, like what occurred that day. Braden Fletcher's body was mangled beyond recognition to those who knew him. His skull had collapsed, and the force had driven splinters of bone into his brain. Blood soaked his shirt, and bruising stretched from his jaw to his lower torso. He died before hitting the ground fully. On a summer day in June 2020, Chasey Scarvilli, who was a 13-year-old, and her older sister, Scout, who was 14, were enjoying their summer vacation. The two sisters had a very close bond, and they did everything with each other, so they decided to set up a hammock outside their home. If you don't know what a hammock is, it's like a piece of strong fabric or netting suspended between 2 points, like trees or posts, used for swinging, resting, or sleeping. It's often hung off the ground and supported by ropes or straps at each end. The girls first thought of setting it up in their front yard, but there was nothing to hang the hammock from, since, like I said, it needs 2 anchor points. So they decided to do it in their backyard. To give a little context, here is the backyard layout. As you stepped outside through the back door or onto a patio, you'd first notice a stone or brick paved area, with garden chairs or a small table for family meals or summer evenings. The landscaping was likely intentional, neatly trimmed bushes, colorful flowers lining the edges. To your left or right, you'd see 2 decorative brick columns, part of a low-standing structure that framed part of the yard, perhaps bordering a flower bed, a raised garden, or a short wall near the patio. And near the most outward pillar, there was a tree close enough to it to make the girls think setting up the hammock between them would be a smart idea. And from the looks of it, it was. The brick pillar looked stable enough, at least to them. So they stretched the hammock to fit between the tree and this brick pillar. After doing that, Scout was the first to get on, and so she did without any trouble. The hammock held. So then she told Chasey to get on, and so she did. And that's where everything went wrong. Remember that brick pillar? It was a decorative piece, meaning it was built for appearance, not function. It wasn't designed to hold weight, anchor objects, or withstand force. Its purpose was purely aesthetic, to make the yard look nice. Unlike structural pillars, which are reinforced with steel rods and filled with concrete or solid material to support buildings, fences, or heavy loads, this decorative pillar was likely hollow and filled with just stacked bricks or mortar. So even though it looked strong, it had no real strength beyond its own shape. So tying a hammock to it introduced a kind of pressure it was never meant to handle, and with that the pillar collapsed. And to make it clear, these were real bricks, so hundreds of pounds of bricks fell on Scout and Chasey, burying them in the bricks. It's not reported how actually tall the pillar was or how many bricks made up the pillar, but it was clearly a substantial amount if it buried them. The girls weren't being supervised by anyone, which, to be fair, it isn't anyone's fault. I mean, they were in the backyard, so nobody thought anything would happen to them. But as the pillar collapsed, it made a loud noise. This would make the father run over to the patio door, and then he saw the brick pillar collapsed, and then he saw the girls under it. The father then ran to them, moving the bricks aside and screaming to the rest of the family to call emergency services while he did CPR, which wouldn't actually do anything because the bricks made their heads bleed and fractured their skulls. Spinal injuries may have occurred from the downward force, possibly snapping their necks or spine instantly. The chest and abdomen would have been crushed, leading to internal bleeding, broken ribs, and ruptured organs like the liver, lungs, or spleen. The weight of the bricks against the hammock also meant their backs would have been pressed against the fabric with nowhere to move or absorb the shock, effectively pinning them and compressing them, so CPR wouldn't have really done anything, but that's the only thing he could do. Emergency services arrived, actually incredibly fast. They transported them to the nearest hospital, but they were pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The official cause of death for both girls would have likely been listed as a blunt force trauma to the head and torso, resulting in fatal internal and external injuries. After an investigation by the police, their deaths were ruled accidental, but they were also violent, sudden, and deeply traumatic, not only physical but emotionally, for everyone who witnessed or responded to the scene. Algonquin Provincial Park is one of Canada's most iconic and historic wilderness areas. It's located in Ontario and about 3 hours north of Toronto, and it's absolutely incredibly large. It spans over to 7,600 square kilometers and home to tons of dense forests, interconnected lakes, rivers, and rocky edges. It's really stunning. This park was also home to a vast network of canoe routes. Actually, there's over 2,000 kilometers of them. Portage trails connect waterways, allowing adventurers to carry their gear in canoes from lake to lake, often trekking across uneven ground or thick brush. This would lead to the Toronto District School Board's REACH program to send students out on a field trip to go and experience it. This program aimed to support youth from underserved communities through outdoor learning experiences. So, in the summer of 2017, a group of high school students from Toronto prepared for an outdoor education trip deep into the wilderness of the park. For many, it was their first time leaving the city, their first brush with raw nature, far from traffic, concrete, and cell towers. And among this group was 15-year-old Jeremiah Perry, a student at C.W. Jeffries Collegiate Institute. A good kid described to be polite and kind-hearted. He was very excited to go, so on July 3rd, 2017, the group set out. The trip was to last 5 days, consisting of canoeing across multiple lakes, setting up campsites, hiking, and learning survival skills. The group was to be supervised by staff, including outdoor education teacher Nicholas Mills, and said to be under the guidance of trained adults. Now, before even going, apparently all safety protocols were in place. Permission forms were signed, waivers were completed, and students were to be screened for their ability to swim, since a large part of the journey would have been in the water canoeing, and supposedly all passed. But by the end of July 3rd, after a day of canoeing, the group started to set up their tents, cooking over fires, and stargazing beneath the summer sky. By July 4th, the group made it deeper into the park. That evening, they camped near Big Trout Lake, a vast open body of water ringed with remote wilderness and no nearby roads or cell service. The next day, July 5th, during a routine stop, students were allowed to enter the water to swim and bathe after paddling. At some point during this afternoon, Jeremiah would enter the water. Details about exactly how it happened remained unclear. What is known is that he slipped under the water and never resurfaced. See, when the students were screened for their ability to swim, Jeremiah actually failed the test. See, all students on water-based excursions had to pass a swimming test in advance, but he failed. He couldn't swim. Actually, in fact, nearly half of the students failed as well. So practically half the students didn't know how to swim, even though a large portion of this field trip would be in the water canoeing. This went directly against TDSB policy, and for whatever reason, they were still allowed to go. Unfortunately for Jeremiah, there were no students and staff nearby, but in the remote setting, emergency response was nearly impossible. Obviously, there was no lifeguard and no rapid way to call for help. Once they realized he was missing and he hadn't returned to shore, the adults began searching the area, calling out, scanning the water, and organizing students. There was immediate efforts to find him, but they were informal and uncoordinated. Since they couldn't call for help having no self-service from that point, some of the staff had to travel, likely by canoe and portage, back to an access point or campsite with communication equipment. This could have taken several hours, depending on their location. When the staff got to the campsite, they alerted Ontario Park staff, who then contacted the Ontario Provincial Police. This triggered the dispatch of the dive team, who were flown in by float planes the following day to conduct the search and recovery. But his body wouldn't be recovered until the next day. When the dive team found him, he clearly had drowned, but they found something else. His fingernails were damaged, meaning he made desperate attempts to claw his way to the surface or grab onto something, anything to survive, but there was no use. The news devastated the group and the greater school community. A boy full of promise and innocence was gone. His father, Winston Davidson, later said that the call from the school board about his son's disappearance came after Jeremiah had already died, and the family had not even known the full nature of the trip he had been sent on. So they didn't even know that he would be canoeing, because clearly they knew he didn't know how to swim, and if they were consulted of this, they would have told them that. What followed was a mixture of grief, anger, and questions, many of which pointed back to why a non-swimmer had been allowed on a multi-day canoe trip across open water. An internal investigation revealed a disturbing truth. Jeremiah had failed the mandatory swim test, and despite that, he had been permitted to attend anyway. Even worse, 14 of the 32 students on the trip had also failed or never completed the test. There had been a serious breach of safety protocol. The teacher in charge, Nicholas Mills, who had been responsible for organizing the trip and ensuring safety compliance, was suspended with pay shortly after. the case was turned over to the police. After a lengthy investigation, Mills was charged in 2019 with criminal negligence causing death. What makes this even crazier is that they weren't even given life jackets, and there was no emergency communication plan in place should something go wrong. In 2023, Mills was rightfully found guilty of criminal negligence causing death, but Mills was only sentenced to 1 year in jail, and followed by probation and a ban from working with children under 16. It was a mid-spring night in Shifnal, Shropshire, the kind of night that felt made for laughter, music, and a few too many drinks. William Hubbard was 19 years old, and he had been out with a group of friends just enjoying the usual scenes of small-town nightlife. He had recently finished college and was thinking about the future, about where he would be working, travel, or maybe getting out of the quiet town he had always known. That night, William was with Oliver Barber, a 20-year-old and a local from the same area. The two weren't strangers, they were actually mutual friends, and the closeness of the neighborhood made it easy to build connections. Barber had driven himself into the town earlier in the evening in his BMW 116, planning on drinks and good company. Despite drinking throughout the night, he chose not to leave his car parked. Instead, he offered friends a ride. I want you to keep that noted. By 2:45 a.m. on May 27th, 2023, Barber was behind the wheel again. William took a seat in the rear passenger side of the vehicle, and two others were in the car as well. As they pulled away from the town, heading along the A464, the BMW tore through the 30 miles per hour zone at over 60 miles per hour. The road was narrow, winding, and quiet at that hour. No traffic, no police, just the sound of the engine pushing harder than it should. Barber was intoxicated, though his judgment, like his vision and his coordination, was too blurred to realize it. At some point, he missed a turn. This wasn't a gentle miscalculation. No, he veered off the road at a high speed, and this would send the vehicle crashing through a steel bollard that tore into the undercarriage. The BMW then launched into a hedgerow, then it skid sideways through grass and brush before slamming at full speed into a solid wooden fence bordering private land. The crash itself was violent. The wood of the fence shattered into splintering stakes, and one large horizontal beam broke loose and was hurled directly into the side of the vehicle, smashing through the window where William sat. The timber post speared through the rear cabin, striking William in the chest and lower abdomen with such force that it pierced through flesh and muscle, fracturing ribs, rupturing organs, and continuing into the seat back behind him. He was impaled by the beam, which drove through his body like a battering ram. The impact was so severe that his body was crushed backward into the car frame, pinned between the splintering wood and the collapsed steel. There was no time to scream, no chance to brace or shield himself. The trauma was instant and catastrophic. The wood punched through his torso, likely shattering vertebrae, destroying arteries, and causing massive internal hemorrhaging. Blood would have filled the cabin, soaking the seat, his clothes, and side panel. He died within seconds, his injuries utterly beyond what any emergency responder could treat. When police and paramedics arrived at the scene, they found the BMW crumbled against the fence line. Barber was conscious, bleeding heavily from his face, but alive. The front seat passengers had minor injuries, but when they reached the rear of the car, they found William's body pale, motionless, and still pinned in place by the jagged beam that had penetrated the car and him. It was clear he had not survived. Investigators arrived shortly after, and the scene was grim. Splintered wood lodged into the frame of the BMW. Blood smeared across the windows and seats. Police noted that no braking had occurred before the crash, confirming that Barber had been speeding uncontrollably at the time of impact. Barber was later arrested at the hospital, where blood tests revealed his blood alcohol level to be 134 milligrams per 100 milliliters, nearly 70% over the legal limit. He was charged with causing death by dangerous driving. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses described the BMW as flying down the road, and experts confirmed that William would have had no chance of survival from such an impalement injury. The judge remarked that Barber's selfish decision to drive drunk and fast had destroyed a life in the most brutal way imaginable. In December 2023, Barber pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 4 years and 8 months in prison and banned from driving for more than 7 years. But no sentence could repair what had been done. On the evening of April 18th, 2024, 6 teenagers from Archie Williams High School in California came together for what was meant to be a simple and carefree outing. They were close friends from neighboring towns like Fairfax. The girls had planned a joyride through the scenic back roads of Marion County, laughter filling the cabin of a Volkswagen Tiguan as they made their way westward along Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. The group was a mix of students, ranging from wide-eyed freshmen to juniors already talking about their futures. Each of them carried a spark, known in their school hallways for the creativity, humor, and closeness. That evening, the excitement was electric. With the sun setting behind the redwoods and hills, they took the road with a sense of freedom and joy only teenagers understand. The vehicle they rode in was a compact SUV, roomy enough for the group to squeeze inside, even if only 5 seats were built for passengers. It's unclear who owned the SUV, but one of the girls had taken the wheel. She was 18, a young driver likely filled with nerves and excitement. It was one of those decisions that felt light in the moment, just a drive, just a night out with friends. But see, Sir Francis Drake Boulevard is a winding stretch of highway that snakes through a valley, a place where towering trees lean over narrow roads and the asphalt curves around bends with little warning. In daylight, it's a stunning ride, but at night it becomes something else. Dark, tight, and flanked by thick woods and steep shoulders. That night, the girls moved quickly, their laughter and music lost into the wind. As the SUV pushed deeper into the valley, they were moving fast. Witnesses would later recall the blur of headlights cutting through the night and the hum of tires pressing harder than they should against the road, its momentum carrying into a stretch of highway known for its sharp curves and unforgiving turns. As they approached one such bend, the SUV strayed off the pavement. The tires skidded across the loose gravel shoulder. Then, without warning, the vehicle jerked sharply off the road and crashed into a massive tree that stood just feet from the asphalt. The force of the impact crumpled the front of the SUV, crushing the engine block inward. Windows burst into fragments, spraying the interior like glass confetti. Metal folded inwards with violent speed. Within seconds, the situation worsened. The crash had caused catastrophic damage to the vehicle's systems. A spark was all it took to trigger a chain of violent, rapid changes inside the engine compartment. The front of the car was suddenly illuminated in orange and yellow. The flames surged quickly, sweeping up the hood and curling along the sides. The air inside the SUV shifted, filled with thick smoke and rising heat. Synthetic materials like plastic and foam began to catch. The entire cabin became a furnace. Some of the girls were still slumped against seat backs or crumpled awkwardly in their seats. Others stirred, frantic, disoriented, trying to make sense of the chaos around them. One girl managed to force her way out to the driver's side, dazed and injured. Another, barely able to move, was pulled from the back seat by a passerby who had seen the fire bloom through the trees and rushed to help. Every second counted. The flames were growing louder, the smoke blacker, and the heat was more intense. Emergency calls flooded dispatch centers. Sirens echoed through the valley, but the response time was strained by distance and darkness. By the time fire crews arrived, the vehicle had been overtaken, its interior reduced to shadows beyond a curtain of fire. Flames roared above the wreck, tires hissing as they melted. The roof began to collapse inward. It took 15 minutes to suppress the fire with water and foam, and even then, the wreck was unrecognizable. A skeletal flame, scorched, and smoke that clung to the air long after the blaze was gone. But see, during the rescue attempts, a few of the girls inside were still alive. Trying to get out, but couldn't. They tried their best to break the window, but couldn't. 4 out of the 6 young girls that were in the car burnt alive, screaming in agony while the firefighters desperately tried to save them, but couldn't. After finally the flames were extinguished, firefighters and paramedics moved in. The inside of the SUV told a story too difficult to forget, one of chaos, confusion, and unbearable heat. The metal interior was warped, pieces of the vehicle fused together by flame. Scattered among the debris were personal items, necklaces, charred mobile phones, a half-melted sneaker, and 4 bodies that were melted beyond recognition. For responders, it was one of the most haunting scenes they have ever worked with. The investigation would later point to inexperience, speed, and road conditions as the likely contributors. Toxicology tests found no alcohol or drugs in the driver's system, but it didn't matter, the damage had already been done. As of this point in time, May 18th, 2025, no one has been charged.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.
In the pre-dawn hours of October 30th, 1992, a 23-year-old man was out having fun, drinking with a female companion. Now this would take place in Issaquah, Washington in a tavern. It's not known what the relationship between them was, but they seemed like friends, because the man's hometown was about 30 miles away from this tavern, so I highly doubt he drove 30 miles from his hometown to a bar alone. But either way, the two were having fun drinking. Then they decided to leave. My guess is because at this time it would have been very late, like 2 a.m. And Washington state law mandates that bars stop serving alcohol by 2 a.m. So they would have had to leave. So after they left, mind you they were still both drunk, they drove from the tavern to a house in the Pine Lake residential area. Once they got out of the car, they continued to drink. I'm guessing this was the woman's house since there was no one else in it other than those two. The house was a standard house of the time, but it also had a hot tub, which they decided to drink in. After some time, the man asked the woman if she wanted to go swim, but the woman was confused because she didn't have a swimming pool, but he meant to swim in the Pine Lake Park. See, the Pine Lake Park region had a residential area and an actual lake area, which was in walking distance of the house. So the man decided he was going to go for a swim in the lake, but the woman initially refused, but then warmed up to the idea, so they began walking to this lake. Now, the lake was where families could go and have a great time swimming in, but this was only allowed in the day and not at night, since at night, well, there's obviously no lifeguard on duty, so this would create a safety hazard, so the lake was closed at night. But there was no security guard to really enforce this, so the man and woman just jumped the fence. They basically entered the lake illegally. But when they entered, the man went straight for the lifeguard tower. As I said, this was a public lake where people would swim at, so this explains the lifeguard tower. And with like most towers, they had a chair, and this chair would be elevated, designed for use by trained staff during the day. The man decided he was going to use it as a diving board because I guess the alcohol in him clouded his judgment, or he really wanted to impress the woman. So he climbed the tower/chair intending to dive into the water, even though the woman was protesting it. But once he got to the top, he dived headfirst into the water. See, this wouldn't really be too bad if the lifeguard tower wasn't positioned to be so close to the shallow water and not deep water. So the water that he dived into was very shallow, likely to be only 4 to 5 feet deep, and when he headfirst dived into the water, the man would headfirst slam right into the lake bed, which could have been covered in rocks or who knows what. This would cause the man to suffer severe neck trauma, like a spinal cord injury, immediate paralysis, and the inability to swim or even move, and this would cause him not to surface. Remember, the woman was just standing close to the lifeguard tower, just watching, but when she realized that he wasn't resurfacing, she panicked and started to scream for help. This scream would actually catch the attention of a nearby resident, a man, Dr. Whitten. He climbed over the fence to go see why the woman was screaming. But this would also catch the attention of another neighbor. This neighbor thought that Dr. Whitten was a prowler, or he was trying to rob the woman. So this neighbor grabs a gun and shoots it in the air, trying to scare him off. Fortunately, no one was hit, but this would startle Dr. Whitten, but he kept running to the woman screaming, "What?" The woman would tell the man about the situation, and Whitten would go in the water, pull the man out, and start CPR. Remember, this is in the 90s, and there was no cell phones yet, so no one had called 911. Only until one of the other neighbors heard a gunshot, and that's when they called the police. So the police came to the scene thinking there was an armed man, but instead they found a woman and a man trying to save another man. The drowning would only become clear once emergency services arrived on scene and assessed the situation. But by the time they finally realized what had happened, the man had already died. Still, the paramedics took over CPR, administered oxygen, possibly used a defibrillator, and prepared the man for transport. The ambulance would transport him to the Overlake Hospital, where he was later pronounced dead. The police did an investigation and found out the neighbor had shot in the air and his reasons for doing that, and then they questioned the woman. The police's final report would say they found no foul play, and no arrests were made in the end. Jamie Lee Horton had just gotten a new snowmobile and was super excited to start riding it. Since he lived in Minnesota, there was an abundance of snow, which made it great for riding snowmobiles. This wouldn't be his first time riding snowmobiles. On the contrary, he grew up riding them and absolutely loved them. Jamie lived with his parents. Even though he was 32 years old, his parents didn't mind. He never got into trouble and he wasn't a pest. So on February 2nd, 2002, Jamie would decide to take his new snowmobile out for a spin. He intended to visit a friend who lived about 15 miles away. But to get to his friend, at least the way he wanted to get to him, was riding through the rural fields of Haverville Township. And through these fields were trees, rocks, and barbed wire fences for private property. But this was the way he wanted to get to his friend's house, so he left on his snowmobile. Now the day that he went was a Saturday, and this Saturday brought poor weather conditions to southeastern Minnesota. The sky was hazy and misty, with wind and blowing snow. This would create dangerous visibility issues, but he thought he could handle it, which he was. But as I said, the conditions weren't ideal for snowmobiling, so not surprisingly, when Jamie was traveling northbound on the east side of 70th Avenue Northeast in the 2900 block, at some point during the ride, likely while cutting across a private farm field, he collided head-on with a barbed wire fence. The wire strung between wooden posts and used to contain livestock was not highly visible in the blowing snow. The thin strands of sharp wire suspended between wooden posts would have blended in with a snowy backdrop, especially with no bright markers or warning signs visible in the mist. And I guess Jamie didn't see it, at least in time, and the impact was quite violent. Traveling forward with no warning, his snowmobile struck the barbed wire, possibly at head or neck height, depending on the terrain and his position on the vehicle. The wire didn't give away, it caught him. The collision caused catastrophic injuries. The barbed wire tore into Jamie's neck and head, inflicting wounds consistent with severe cervical trauma. It may have nearly decapitated him or caused fatal damage to his airway, blood vessels, or spine. The force of the impact likely threw him from the snowmobile, his body possibly rolling or collapsing into the snow within seconds. There was no helmet or jacket strong enough to stop the wire from cutting through him at that speed and angle. He died there alone in the snow, with no one around to witness or intervene. He was only found later that morning. Emergency responders were called, but there was nothing they could do. Jamie had died at the scene. Now, the authorities did not find evidence of excessive speed, alcohol, or erratic behavior. He was simply riding alone through conditions that made even a familiar environment treacherous. His mother, Pam Horton, later told reporters that her son had left to visit a friend, and he was on his way there when the accident happened. She believed the fence had been obscured by snow and was difficult to see. The county coroner arrived on the scene and noted that although the wind was blowing at that time, visibility appeared acceptable. That detail would later become part of the legal controversy that would follow. And the days after his death, the Horton family filed a wrongful death lawsuit. Jerome Lawler, the landowner whose fence Jamie had struck. The family's claims centered on the argument that the barbed wire fence had not been adequately marked for winter visibility, especially given that snowmobilers commonly pass through that area. The defense responded by stating that Jamie had been trespassing on private property and that the fence was part of a normal legal maintained farm operation. The trial presented a difficult and emotionally charged case. Was the landowner responsible for not making a wire fence more visible in the snow, or was Jamie, even as an experienced rider, responsible for entering private property and not recognizing the hazard? Ultimately, the case moved forward, with the jury tasked with determining liability. No criminal charges were ever filed, and the death was ruled an accident. On On the morning of April 10th, 2025, a rural property outside Tulane, Victoria began its day like many others across Central Australia's farming belt. The early hours were cool and quiet. Morning fog lingered slightly over low pastures. By mid-morning, the air had warmed, and the property was active. A flatbed truck had arrived with a delivery of rectangular hay bales, and preparations were being made to begin unloading. The delivery was typical for the area. Farms across Tulane and surrounding districts rely heavily on transported feed during dry months. The bales were arranged in 3 tiers, stacked in a pyramid formation with 2 full rows and a third centered on top. Each bale measured about 2.4 meters long and 0.9 meters high, and varied between 350 and 500 kilograms depending on compaction and moisture content. The truck driver was a 48-year-old man, believed to be well acquainted with regional transport, was on foot beside the trailer. His role was likely to assist with positioning or documentation, while a tractor operator prepared to lift the bales using hydraulic forks. The unloading process began. The truck moved slowly toward the trailer. No cones or exclusion zones had been marked. The ground was dry and level, though no buffers were in place to separate on-foot personnel from the lifting area. What occurred next was not anticipated. One of the top-tier bales had shifted. There was no external trigger, no visible warning. A slight lean, a vibration, or even tension in the twine could have been enough. The bale came free from its centered stack and rolled from the trailer's edge. In less than a second, it fell, and it landed on the man standing below. The impact was severe. The bale, now moving under gravity, struck the man's head, shoulders, and chest. The full weight drove him into the compacted earth below. The force caused catastrophic trauma. His ribs collapsed, internal organs were damaged by the pressure, his spine and skull may have fractured on contact. A nearby worker witnessed the incident and immediately called 000. Emergency responders from Health Codes or Bendigo were dispatched without delay. Now, given Tulane's rural isolation, response time ranged from 15 to 30 minutes, depending on road conditions and team availability. When paramedics did arrive, they found the man unresponsive and pinned beneath the bale, and there was no sign of life. The bale was moved using the tractor under medical direction so that his body could be respectfully recovered. Police were informed, the site was sealed, and WorkSafe Victoria was contacted shortly thereafter and initiated a full investigation. The process began with photographic documentation of the site, equipment, and layouts. They reviewed the positioning of the bales, the tractor's location, and spoke to any witness present. They noted that the trailer lacked any lateral to secure the top-tier bales. Investigators also noted that no visible safety barriers had been in place. There was no cones, tapes, or personal exclusion zones around the trailer or lifting path. The tractor operator's visibility had been limited by the height of the bales and was unaware that the man was positioned within what safety manuals refer to as the fall radius, also known as the insecure zone. It was further noted that no spotter had been assigned to the operation. In many large agricultural or industrial settings, a secondary person oversees blind zones during mechanical movement, but in this case, the task had been performed informally. Not uncommon in smaller or independently operated properties. Although the trailer used was not equipped with bale guards, upright steel supports along the sides designated to prevent lateral slippage. Though not legally mandated on every farm vehicle, their absence during high-tier loading increases fall risk. WorkSafe process would continue in the weeks that followed, including a full analysis of medical condition, load documentation, site safety history, and a final report summarizing all contributing factors. Tulane itself is a quiet farming town northwest of Bendigo. The land is flat and open, making it suitable for broad acre operations and hay production. With a population of just over 200, it's a tight-knit community, and it's familiar with hard work, shared responsibility, and practical labor. But incidents like these are rare, but when they occur, they affect everyone involved. Now, the victim's name was not released to the public, but he was remembered informally by peers in the freight and farming community. And as of now, the company has not been sued or fined. On a bitterly cold day in December 1989, the Ramford Brewery in Essex, England was wrapping up the holiday season. The air inside the sprawling industrial building was thick with the scent of fermenting hops and yeast. Metal pipes hissed, valves dripped, and towering fermentation vats, each capable of holding thousands of gallons, lined the interior like monuments to Britain's beer-making legacy. For Ronald Henry Fincham, a 60-year-old brewery worker, that day marked 25 years of service. He had been a steady fixture at the brewery, quiet, consistent, and experienced. After a workplace gathering to mark his 25th anniversary, he disappeared from the social area without explanation. Hours passed, he never returned home, and his co-workers began searching the premises. They eventually found a troubling clue: his clothing, neatly folded on the floor near one of the towering vats. This industrial tank was filled with over 35,000 pints of beer, or roughly 20,000 liters of liquid. Still uncertain what had happened, brewery staff began draining the vat. It took time. These vessels were built to hold massive volumes, sealed at the top, and only accessible through metal ladders or hatches. As the golden fluid gurgled out and sank lower and lower, a dark shape began to appear at the bottom. It wasn't a tool, and it wasn't debris. It was Ronald Fincham's body, suspended in the remaining beer, limp and lifeless. The sheer size of the vat had made escape impossible once submerged. Fincham, for reasons still unknown, climbed inside, fully naked, and either slipped or intentionally submerged himself. At the time, there was no witnesses, no surveillance cameras. And obviously there was no surveillance cameras, and no immediate understanding of why he did it. What is known, however, is what happens when a human drowns, especially in a vat of alcohol. Once Fincham's head dipped beneath the surface and he couldn't reach the edge to hoist himself back up, his survival instincts would have kicked in. He likely thrashed and flailed, trying to push himself upward in the thick liquid. Beer is less buoyant than water due to its sugar and alcohol content, and it makes floating more difficult. There would have been no visibility, only darkness, bubbles, and the sloshing sound of his own movement echoing inside the still vat. As the oxygen in his lungs depleted, his throat and chest would have burned. He would have tried to hold his breath, fighting the urge to inhale, but eventually the body forces a desperate gasp in the liquid. The beer would have rushed into his mouth, throat, and lungs, filling them and cutting off oxygen at the cellular level. Coughing would have been impossible. The last moments would have included violent spasms, muscle cramps, and eventually the onset of hypoxia. As brain function faltered, awareness would have faded. Still, drowning usually takes about 2 to 3 minutes. If he remained conscious for even part of that time, the suffering would have been intense. When his body was recovered, his lungs were saturated, his airway blocked by foam and fluid. The pressure of being submerged in a sealed industrial vat surrounded by alcohol magnified the trauma. To be honest, it's kind of ironic. He drowned in the very product he had spent decades trying to help create. The coroner ultimately ruled the death as from natural causes, citing drowning, and noted that alcohol consumption might have impaired his judgment, but wasn't listed as the direct cause. To this day, it still remains unclear whether he had intended to die. No note was left, and he had no known mental health issues. Although some speculated that he was confused or mildly intoxicated and thought the beer might be soothing to wade in, his folded clothing, found neatly beside the vat, pointed toward an intentional entry. But the motive remained a mystery. This case would actually make headlines for its strange, almost surreal nature. Investigators determined that there had been no mechanical failure, the vats were structurally sound, and no one else was involved. It was simply one man left alone who entered a vat and never came out. And yes, the beer in the tank, over 35,000 pints, was discarded.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.
As of 2025, South Africa has 21 national parks. These parks protect a wide range of ecosystems from deserts and savannas to forests and coastlines, and they are all equally beautiful. To name a few, there's Otto Elephant National Park, famous for elephants. It also includes marine conservation. And then there's Table Mountain National Park, located in Cape Town. It includes Table Mountain and Cape Point. But Kruger National Park is South Africa's crown jewel. It stretches across nearly 20,000 square kilometers of South African wilderness that includes countless animals, including the Big Five, which are lions, leopards, elephants, rhinos, and buffaloes. Because of this, it would be the biggest tourist attraction in South Africa. It annually pulls 1.5 million visitors, and among these millions was a 59-year-old grandpa. He was a grandfather from the town of Mankado in Mpumalanga, traveling with his 2 grandchildren, an 11-year-old and a 5-year-old. He had brought them to the park for a peaceful visit, a chance to show them elephants and other animals in their natural habitat. They arrived first near Malawi Gate, a southern entry point into the park, popular for its river views and elephant sightings. It wasn't very far from the reception area, just over a low bridge and into a lightly wooded stretch of land. But what they didn't know was that an elephant herd was actually nearby, and one of the bulls had already taken notice of them. At some point, according to witness accounts and park officials, the children stepped a little further into the bush, just beyond the standard tourist viewing path. Maybe for a better view, maybe just from innocent curiosity, but whatever the case, that was when a bull elephant separated slightly from the rest of the herd and took a few steps toward them. At first, it would have seemed like nothing. A slow walk, ears fanning, and dust kicking up with each step. And then it broke into a charge. The elephant roared forward, its pace exploding into a sprint that few expect from something so massive, and within seconds, it was barreling through the underbrush, head low, trunk curled slightly in aggression. The sound of branches snapping, hooves hammering the ground, and its deep growl must have filled the air like thunder. The older child grabbed the younger one's hand and screamed. They ran. They ran toward their grandfather, who was now yelling at them to come back, to get behind him, and they did. But that's also when the grandfather, acting on instinct, placed himself directly between his grandchildren and the charging elephant. And not surprising, the elephant would hit him. Not just with its trunk, which alone is powerful enough to lift trees, but with its entire body. The force threw him backward, smashing him into the ground. Then it trampled him, not once, not twice, but over and over. The kids would describe the sounds as bones snapping like dry branches, the thudding of the elephant's legs coming down repeatedly with gruesome rhythm. The elephant's trunk lashed out at him and whipped across the torso, tearing through cloth and skin like paper. His ribcage caved, his face was crushed, one leg was shattered at the femur, nearly torn from the hip. Part of his shoulder was later described as being flattened beyond recognition, and to make it all worse, he was still alive for part of it. The children were paralyzed with shock just feet away, watched it unfold. They were too young to understand what their eyes were showing them, too close to be spared the image. They screamed until their throats went raw. The older grandchild, trying to cover the younger one, suffered injuries to the leg during the fall and scramble. But neither of them were touched by the elephant again. After nearly 30 seconds of violence, the elephant paused. Then, for reasons no one could determine, it stopped. Perhaps the rage had passed, but slowly it turned and ambled back toward the trees, silent, unhurried. By the time park rangers and emergency personnel arrived, he was already gone. His body was beyond saving and nearly beyond recognition. Large patches of skin were torn off, his abdomen was collapsed inward, blood and tissue soaked the grass in the wide radius. The children were taken away immediately. The 11-year-old was treated for a deep laceration on the leg. The 5-year-old was miraculously unharmed, though both were deeply traumatized. Officials were swift to launch an internal investigation. Due to the number of elephants in the area and the confusion of the scene, that specific bull responsible could never be identified. There would be no culling and no punishment. It had happened within the animal's natural space, triggered by what it likely perceived as an encroachment. An inquest was opened not just to document the event, but to underscore the warning that Kruger, while open to the public, remains a wild and untamed place. Tourists are repeatedly cautioned never to exit their vehicles and never to approach animals under any circumstances, not for a better photo or not for a closer look. In the early hours of a quiet June morning in 2020, the city of Palmade, California was still. The sun had not risen yet, and Pontchartrain Square, a small public park directly across from Palmade City Hall, sat empty and dimly lit. It was the kind of place people usually pass through during the day, never giving it much thought. But at around 3:30 a.m., a passerby walking through the square noticed something unusual near one of the large trees. In the shadows, a human figure was suspended from a thick, high branch, and the figure wasn't moving. It was Robert Fuller. He was just 24 years old. By 3:39 a.m., emergency responders arrived. Paramedics quickly determined that there were no vital signs and Robert was already dead. He had been hanging from the tree by a red rope, tied tightly around his neck and anchored to a high branch in a way that made it clear that this was no accident. His eyes were partially opened, his tongue protruded slightly, and there were dark bruises forming around his neck where the rope had been pulled and crushed the skin. His face was tinged bluish purple, his lips pale, his body was limp, and rigor mortis had not yet set in, meaning the event had likely occurred not long before discovery. The rope had cut deeply into the flesh under his jaw, leaving a clean, brutal groove. Blood had pooled in his feet and legs, which dangled a few feet off the ground, and insect activity had already begun. He had unfortunately took his own life. Investigators from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department arrived soon after. The scene was secured and quickly escalated due to public sensitivity. Not only was this a hanging death in a public square, it occurred amid national protests against racial injustice and police violence. Just after the incident of George Floyd, this would make the public immediately raise alarms. The image of a young black man hanging from a tree in front of a city hall was not just disturbing, it was deeply symbolic. Was this someone deleting themselves, or was it a lynching? The FBI and California Department of Justice joined the investigation. The coroner began a full forensic analysis. Initially, officials were cautious about ruling out any possibilities. Protesters would gather and outrage grew on social media. Robert's family demanded answers, and they weren't alone. But as the evidence was gathered, investigators uncovered chilling and heartbreaking details. First, surveillance footage and forensic inspection showed no signs of a struggle. Robert's hands had not been bound, and there were no scratches on his arms or knuckles. There were no signs of restraint, and he had not tried to remove the rope, nor was there any foreign DNA under his fingernails. It was a clean, uninterrupted act. And the rope had been secured from inside the tree, with multiple points of anchor, indicating that the person who tied it had climbed up the tree themselves. And that person was Robert. Records later revealed that he had walked to a Dollar Tree store on May 14th, identical to the one used in the hanging, using his EBT card. The receipt and security footage confirmed the purchase. But see, that's the thing, he bought the rope at a Dollar Tree store, and the knot was, well, he shouldn't have used that knot because it wasn't optimized for a quick loss of consciousness. I know that sounds weird, but let me explain. Since he used that knot, it wasn't an instant death, like he probably thought it was gonna be. In fact, he likely experienced prolonged suffering. The ligature mark was consistent with a static suspension, meaning the body hung and pressure was constant, not a sudden drop. There was no drop involved like in gallows-style executions, so there was no cervical spine fracture, which is typically what causes immediate unconsciousness or death and a long drop hanging. Instead, the method caused asphyxiation. The rope pressed slowly and painfully across his airway and carotid arteries. Fuller likely struggled for air for at least 2 to 6 minutes, and he would have been conscious for part of that time, with panic and suffering present. His tongue was protruding, and his eyes were partially open, further indicating a slow and traumatic death. This form of deleting yourself is unfortunately common among those with limited resources or impulsive mental health crisis, and it often resulted in significant pain and suffering. As the investigation deepened, so did the tragedy. Robert Fuller had a documented history of mental illness. Between 2017 and 19, he had been hospitalized multiple times for the idea of deleting himself. He had told health workers that he heard voices, and he had even attempted to delete himself while trying to set himself on fire. In one report, doctors noted that he had often struggled with feelings of isolation and deep depressive episodes. No note was found near the body, but his online activity, personal items, and mental health history painted a grim picture. Robert had been suffering, privately and quietly, and on that night he chose a very public and irreversible exit. The official autopsy confirmed cause of death was asphyxiation due to hanging. The ligature mark on the neck matched the rope in width and pattern, and there was no defensive wounds. No drugs or alcohol were found in his system. The Los Angeles medical examiner ultimately ruled the death as him taking his own life. To be clear, investigators found no signs of foul play. Also, if you are having mental problems, please talk to someone, and I guarantee you taking your own life will not solve any of these problems. The air in rural Malawi was dry that evening, the kind of dusk where the heat had retreated, but the scent of dust and wood smoke still clung to the air. The village of Nathalri, nestled near the edge of Wazaa Marsh Wildlife Reserve, was quiet. Most families had retreated into their homes for the night with the doors latched, fires dimmed, and children hushed. But Simon Chira, a 31-year-old farmer and father of two, was still out. He had left earlier that afternoon to visit his cousin in a nearby village a few kilometers away. These journeys weren't unusual, in fact they were common among locals. A walk through the bush path and along the reserve's edges, cutting time off the main road. The risk was known, but so was the routine. Most villagers knew the tracks well and had walked them their entire lives. Simon was making his return just after nightfall. Now there was no streetlights to guide him, just the moonlight, flickering through scattered clouds and the distant hum of insects vibrating in the grass. He had only a stick in hand, not uncommon in these areas, used both for support and to ward off wild dogs, snakes, or the occasional baboon. But he didn't know he was being watched. Several kilometers from home, near a bend in the narrow path through the brush, the grass stirred. What emerged from the thicket was not one, but two adult hyenas, large and brazen. These were spotted hyenas, creatures with powerful jaws, capable of crushing bone, and known to scavenge but also to hunt when desperate. And trust me, they were desperate. Over the past year, worsening droughts had pushed wildlife deeper into human settlements. Elephants trampled crops, lions had taken livestock, and the hyenas, and growing more fearless, had taken to following people. Now Simon may have noticed them, he might have turned around and shouted, waved his stick, but hyenas are patient predators. One might have lunged while the other circled, but by the time the screaming began, there was no one near enough to hear him. The first bite shattered Simon's lower leg, teeth puncturing through bone and muscle. He fell, still fighting, clawing at the dirt, swinging his stick wildly, but it was no use. The second hyena clamped its jaws onto his shoulder, tearing chunks away of his skin. Their tactic was merciless. They began eating him alive without waiting for death. His abdomen was torn open, his intestines pulled out. The hyenas were going for nutrient-rich organs. They knew what they wanted. The liver, the kidneys, and heart are prized by scavengers for the density of vitamins and minerals. The attackers went for them while Simon was still conscious, gasping and choking on blood, and also twitching in the dirt. He likely died minutes later from a combination of blood loss, shock, and excruciating pain. When searchers found his body early the next morning, alerted by his family when he didn't return, it was ripped apart, barely recognizable. His face was mostly intact, but his chest had been crushed in, his ribcage exposed, and his stomach cavity was hollowed out. One arm had been chewed to the bone, his legs, clawed and mangled, were surrounded by drag marks, and blood-soaked earth and vultures had begun to circle. What remained of Simon was buried quickly under heavy emotion and heavier silence. Local authorities confirmed the attack as it wasn't the first, though it was the most brutal in years. In the weeks that followed, people in the area refused to walk at night, and children were kept inside even during dusk, which was smart. The Parks Department launched a patrol, but the damage was done. Wildlife experts issued a statement. Human-wildlife conflict in Malawi was escalating. Droughts were driving animals closer to settlements, and the marsh reserve in particular had become a flashpoint. Illegal poaching had wiped out much of the hyena's natural prey, and now humans had become the easiest target. But for Simon's family, however, this was not an ecological crisis. It was a personal nightmare, a loss so violent that no one in the village could speak of it without unease. His wife, who identified what was left of him by the clothes he wore, collapsed at the burial, and his children still asked why their father never came back. His final moments were not peaceful. They were not quiet, they were violent, drawn out, and terrifying. A man overtaken by beasts dragged into the underbrush and ripped apart limb by limb while still breathing. The skies above Botavia, Brazil, are considered sacred ground by skydivers. Known as the national capital of parachuting, the airspace is busy with daily jumps, often numbering in the hundreds. That weekend in October 2024, the conditions were near perfect: blue skies, manageable winds, and a lively but focused atmosphere on the ground. Carolina Munoz Kennedy, a 40-year-old chiropractor and experienced skydiver, was a familiar face in Botavia's tightly knit skydiving community. She had lived in Brazil for 5 years, logged hundreds of jumps since beginning the sport in 2013, and was a licensed member of the Brazilian Parachuting Confederation. She was known for her discipline and her growing doubts about how long she actually wanted to keep jumping. But that day, Carolina had been part of a group completing multiple jumps. Like I said, she wasn't a beginner. In fact, she often mentored others and on exit positioning, altitude awareness, and body control. This jump, sometime in the afternoon of October, she boarded the plane like always, calm, gear checked, straps secured. She wore a modern rig with an AAD, a main chute, and a reserve. There was nothing visibly wrong with the equipment on the ground. At around 13,000 feet, she jumped. Witnesses on the ground and fellow divers from the plane watched as she entered freefall. Her form was stable. She fell for roughly 45 seconds, belly to earth, maintaining a controlled position until she reached deployment altitude around 4,000 feet. She pulled, but the main parachute failed to fully deploy, something later believed to be a line twist or bag lock malfunction, which caused it to partially inflate, then violently collapse. Instead of slowing her descent, it began spinning her mid-air in a destabilized corkscrew motion. Those watching from below saw the chute behind her like tangled fabric in a wind tunnel. She would immediately reach for a cutaway handle, a routine emergency procedure. She pulled it successfully, detaching the main parachute. Now in pure freefall again, she attempted to deploy her reserve. And that's when everything went catastrophically wrong. Her reserve parachute, which should have opened automatically via the AAD, if not manually pulled, malfunctioned as well. Whether the pilot chute failed to extract the reserve properly, or the rig experienced a pilot chute hesitation, has not been fully determined, but what is clear is that the reserve did not deploy in time. What opened, if at all, was far too little and far too late. She was now falling uncontrollably at a terminal velocity about 200 kilometers per hour, and the impact was instantaneous and devastating. She hit the ground feet first but slightly tilted, causing her body to snap backward violently. Her legs shattered, the femurs breaking through skin, her pelvis was crushed from the sheer vertical compression, and the force surged upward, causing massive internal bleeding, tearing through major organs including her liver and spleen. Her ribcage exploded inward, piercing her lungs and heart. Her spine fractured in multiple places, with bone fragments driven into the spinal cord and surrounding muscle, according to the on-site medical team. But even before they arrived, bystanders knew there was no surviving what they had just seen. Her helmet was still on, her eyes were closed, blood poured around her crushed torso and lower limbs. Her jumpsuit had been split in areas where the bones had burst outward. A long red streak marked the place of initial impact and her final stop. A crowd quickly formed, but silence hung heavy. In a sport where injuries happened, a double parachute failure is one of the most feared and rare events. Carolina's incident was caught on camera by nearby skydivers and helmet cams, but was not made public. Though the footage did show the failed main, the chaotic spin, and the long haunting fall with no working canopy, the Brazilian Parachuting Confederation and police launched an investigation. The equipment was seized, witnesses were interviewed, and early results pointed to a freak coincidence of failures. A main chute that didn't fully open, a reserve that either failed to extract or tangled, and the odds were a lot, but not impossible. Carolina's remains were cremated on October 30th, and her ashes were attended by friends and family who flew in from Chile and Brazil.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.
As of 2025, there's been thousands of people who have circumnavigated the world. This includes either walking, flying, or sailing. And many of these people achieve this with stops here and there and having either a crew or someone else going with them. But very few dare to try this feat alone and with no stops. But one of these brave souls was Jur Sturk, a Slovenian man born in 1937. Now, it's not known what actually got him into sailing, as Yugoslavia had a very narrow coastline, and his family weren't really sailors, but by a young age he fell in love with the idea of sailing, although his profession was being an electrical engineer. But when Yugoslavia's borders opened more in the 1970s and 80s, he started to live out his dream in sailing in the open water. As he went on a few expeditions, he sailed to the Mediterranean and then to the Atlantic. But one of his biggest accomplishments would happen in the early 1990s, where he would actually circumnavigate the world. He sailed a 6.5 meter or 21 foot sailboat that he actually built himself, with making multiple stops along the way. Now, this would be a big deal in Slovenia because, well, no one from that country has ever actually done that. But he wasn't finished. His next goal was to become the oldest person to sail around the world alone, without stops and without engine power, all in a boat he built himself. By 2007, he was well into his 70s, and this would be the time he would decide to try to circumnavigate the world again. He set out from Tauranga, New Zealand, in December 2007, sailing westward, but he wasn't stupid. This would be a very challenging feat to accomplish, and an incredibly dangerous one. So he remained in contact through high-frequency radio, regularly speaking with other sailors and amateur radio operators around the world. He provided updates on his position, weather conditions, and general status. Those who spoke to him noted his calm tone and precise observations. He seemed focused, experienced, and very comfortable being alone at sea. Throughout 2008, he made steady progress. He crossed the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and made his way across the Atlantic, and would pass Cape Horn. He was completing the route, and as 2009 approached, he was on his way back through the Indian Ocean, heading home. Everything seemed fine and okay, until it came to January 1st in 2009. He was approximately 1,000 nautical miles off the western coast of Australia, sailing northeast. Like every few days, he would be in contact with someone, and in this call, he mentioned that everything was fine, and that he intended to clean the rudder soon. He gave no indication of distress, fatigue, or technical issues. Then, all communication stopped. This would be the final call he would ever make. At first, it wasn't seen as unusual because solar sailors often pass through stretches of poor reception, or they just want to conserve battery power. But as days became weeks, concern would grow. Other sailors and radio operators attempted to contact, but no response came, and there was no emergency beacons activated, or no distress signals. No one knew what was going on. Weeks had passed with still no response. Until, on January 26, 2009, a merchant ship spotted a ship adrift in the Indian Ocean with the sails torn and flapping. The vessel looked abandoned and no one was seen on board, so not surprising no attempts were made to tow or board the vessel at that time. And it continued drifting, but on the back of the ship there was a plate, and it said Lieutenant. This was George Sturck's ship, but where was he? Then, on April 30th, 2009, over 3 months later, the same abandoned ship with the plate Lieutenant was found again, this time by the research ship RV Roger Revell west of Australia. The crew boarded the yacht to assess its conditions and search for signs of life. Inside, they found no one. Sturck was gone, and there was no signs of a struggle, damage, or sabotage. The boat was intact and still floating. The sails were tattered and the forestay, a crucial part of the rigging, had snapped. But below deck was dry and in good order. And not only that, Sturck's belongings were still there and also intact. Charts, books, and bedding. And most notably, his logbook. The final entry in the log was dated January 2nd, 2009, just 1 day after his last known radio communication. It contained standard notes on the weather and location. Nothing unusual, no distress, and no hint that anything was wrong. So what the hell happened? Where was Sturck? Well, no one really knows. But after examining the boat, those involved concluded that Sturck had likely fallen overboard during a routine task, perhaps while adjusting the sails or inspecting the rudder as he planned. The sea in that part of the Indian Ocean is unpredictable. A sudden swell or misstep can easily cause a solar sailor to lose balance. So as he fell in the ocean, he would have likely tried to swim back to the boat to only realize it was impossible to catch. So either from exhaustion or him accepting his fate, he would have most likely have drowned. This of course is the most optimistic possibility, as another could have been him being eaten alive by sharks. To support this theory of him falling into the water, his personal locator beacon was never triggered, and no life raft was missing. There was no indication that he had left the boat intentionally. Obviously no body was found and probably won't ever be because he was lost in the middle of the Indian Ocean. George Sturck was declared lost at sea in 2009. The precise details of what actually happened to him will never be fully known, but the evidence does point toward him being lost at sea, even though it is kinda creepy to think there might be other possibilities at play. But with no solid evidence, I'm going to conclude he drowned at sea after falling off his boat. On March 17th, 2025, at exactly 3:04 p.m., an SOS message was transmitted from an Apple device via satellite to emergency dispatchers in Doucette County, Oregon. The message included a precise GPS location that read, "Trapped and injured person in steep terrain." The signal came from the west side of Mount Bachelor, a popular ski destination known for its steep snow and sprawling tree-lined slopes. Whether triggered by crash detection or manually activated under duress, the message launched an urgent rescue effort. Emergency coordination began immediately. The Mount Bachelor Ski Patrol was dispatched first, racing across snowy ridgelines and tight tree paths to reach the coordinates. Simultaneously, the Doucette County Sheriff's Office, search and rescue teams, and Airlink helicopter medics began organizing support from both air and ground. Dispatchers were able to contact someone at the scene, likely a skiing companion who had already begun trying to free the trapped individual and was given real-time updates to 911 operators. When responders reached the site, they found a patch of dense forest off the edge of a skiable slope. Near the base of a tall evergreen, a small section of ski gear was barely visible above the snow. The rest was buried. Benjamin Shelkey, a 34-year-old skier from Seattle, had fallen into what appeared to be a tree well, an invisible trap created by loose snow at the base of large conifers. He was found head first, with only his lower legs and boots visible above the snow line. His upper body had disappeared into a tight, downward funnel of powder. Earlier that morning, Benjamin had set out for a ski trip in the mountains with at least one other person. Mount Bachelor, which is the mountain that he was skiing on, is located in central Oregon, and it had just received a fresh dump of snow, actually over 3 feet in just a couple of days. For skiers like Benjamin, this kind of day was actually perfect for exploring the more remote areas of the resort tree runs, steep terrain, and untouched powder. By the early afternoon, Benjamin and at least one companion were skiing the west side of Mount Bachelor. which is a less traffic zone known for its trees, tight glades, and rolling drops, but far enough out that rescue access could take time. Around this area, large trees aline the slopes, perfect spots for soft powder to gather, but beneath those trees lay a hidden danger. Tree wells, loose pockets of snow that accumulate around the base of tree trunks, invisible from above and nearly impossible to escape from once fallen in. At some point while navigating this terrain, Benjamin likely made a turn too close to one of the larger trees or hit a soft patch of snow. Whether it was a fall, a misjudged line, or just terrible luck, he dropped into a tree well head first. The powder immediately began to collapse around him, locking his arms and chest in place. Snow would press against his face, and the more he moved, the tighter it packed. And then, moments later, the SOS message was transmitted from one of Benjamin's Apple devices. The companion had already been digging for over 15 minutes. The snow was dry and fluffy on the surface, but denser and heavier below, making excavation slow and difficult. Rescuers took over immediately. They carefully removed the snow from around Benjamin's helmet, neck, and shoulders, working with urgency while trying not to collapse the surrounding layers. Tree wells are unstable. Every handful of snow removed risks another collapse. Once they reached his face, they saw the horrifying reality. Benjamin was unresponsive. His mouth and nose had been packed tightly with snow, and the surrounding powder had frozen against his skin. Keep in mind there was no air pockets. His arms were trapped against his chest, unable to move. The initial signs pointed to snow immersion, one of the most silent and suffocating threats a skier can face. CPR began immediately on the scene. Chest compressions, rescue breaths, and emergency assessment protocols were carried out as snow continued to fall into the hole they dug. The cold was biting, the terrain uneven, and every second counted. Despite the effort, Benjamin remained motionless. Although he was transported by Airlink helicopters to the Mount Bachelor Clinic, where medical staff continued attempts to resuscitate him. But after all interventions were tried, he was declared deceased. The official cause of death was snow immersion suffocation, more technically referred to as non-avalanche related snow immersion death. This occurs when a person is trapped in deep, unconsolidated snow, most often head first, and is unable to free themselves. Tree cells are the primary source of these incidents. Falling into one means falling straight down with skis, poles, and arms getting wedged awkwardly, and unfortunately this fate would befall Benjamin. The sun bore down heavily that afternoon on the Mississippi River Delta, where warm air hung thick with humidity and the dark waters sloshed lazily against the sides of a small pilot boat. It was July 1st, 1879, and 10-year-old Gus Eriksson, a Swedish-born boy, stood aboard the vessel with several other passengers and crew. Gus had likely come to the United States not long before. He was the son of Eric Eriksson, immigrants from Sweden. For reasons lost to time, the boy had found himself aboard a small boat operated near the mouth of the Mississippi, where it meets the Gulf of Mexico. Whether he was simply traveling with others or assisting the crew, no one can say for sure. But what is known is that sometime that afternoon, the boat capsized. In the chaos, passengers and crew were thrown into the water. Screams cut across the river bank, and wooden planks slapped into the current as the vessel flipped over. Gus, like the others, was plunged beneath the surface, although he managed to resurface and cling to the light buoy. The crude float was just large enough to keep him above water, and for a time it seemed as though everything would be fine. The muddy current was strong, but Gus was staying afloat, drifting amid the wreckage of the boat and trying to stay calm. Witnesses on a nearby vessel saw him in the water, invisible and stable, calling out for help. But the Mississippi's mouth is a dangerous place. Its water a swirling mix of salt and fresh water, deep and warm, teeming with life both seen and unseen. Suddenly, the calm was broken. From beneath the surface, a shadow approached. Fast and purposeful, it circled once, perhaps curious at first, but then charged with terrifying speed. No one could stop it. With incredible force, the predator exploded from below, smashing through the surface and biting down on Gus's lower body. His scream was brief, high-pitched, and silenced almost immediately.
The animal was a tiger shark, likely between 8 and 12 feet long, although we don't know for certain as this was over a century ago. Although we do know a tiger shark's jaw is powerful enough to split bone with ease, and in one single bite, it crushed the boy's right leg and lower torso. Gus was dragged under the water, still partially clinging to the life buoy, which quickly turned red as his blood spilled into the river. Witnesses described seeing the water erupt as if a cannon had been fired from below. There was a swirl of red and white foam followed by flailing limbs and the rapid whipping of a tail slicing through the surface. One man shouted that he saw the boy go under and then reappear, but only for a moment. What was left of him was motionless. There was no second chance. The shark thrashed violently with its prey, tearing at the body until it was unrecognizable. A 12-inch wide chunk of flesh was reportedly torn from Gus's right leg, but by the time anyone could get close enough to intervene, it was far too late. The boy, torn loose, floated empty. By the time rescuers reached the scene, which we don't know actually how long it took for them to get there, but when they did, Gus was gone. His body had vanished beneath the water, likely taken fully by the shark or swept away by the river's relentless current. The others aboard the boat were rescued, and some injuries were reported from the capsizing, but none came close to what happened to the boy. There was no body to recover, no burial, only blood in the water and stunned silence among the men who had witnessed it. Reports of the incident would spread through local towns and shipping communities, gaining traction due to the sheer horror of the attack. Shark sightings in the Mississippi were rare but not unheard of. Scientists later confirmed that tiger sharks are fully capable of traveling into brackish river mouths. Especially in search of prey. Most people believe sharks only pose a threat in open ocean. Gus's death shattered that assumption. The story was picked up in maritime records and later entered into shark attack registries. Modern database listed as a confirmed fatal shark attack, one of the few 19th century deaths of its kind recorded in US waters. Several accounts note that the attack occurred while the boy was floating on a life buoy after a boat capsized, emphasizing the helplessness of the victim and the sudden brutal nature of the predator's strike. In retrospect, it is not difficult to understand how it happened. The Gulf of Mexico's waters near the Mississippi's mouth are warm, nutrient-rich, and draw all manner of marine life. And tiger sharks, known for their aggression and lack of dietary discrimination, patrol these areas often. A struggling human in the water may have appeared similar to an injured animal, or an easy target.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.
In November 2015, two young men, Matthew Ridgens and Jordan King, planned to sneak into the Barefoot Bay neighborhood of Brevard County, Florida at night. The area was largely populated by retirees and had recently seen a series of quiet break-ins. These two men saw an opportunity, moved silently through the backyards, checked for unlocked doors or valuables, and get out fast. It was meant to be a one-night job, fast and easy. At approximately 2 a.m., residents noticed the figures of two men moving between homes, dressed in black, behaving very suspiciously. One resident phoned the sheriff's office and deputies were dispatched immediately, arriving minutes later. Upon seeing the patrol cars, the two suspects scattered into the darkness. Jordan King would later be apprehended without incident, but Matthew Ridgens was never found. At first, no one knew exactly what had happened, but the night of the attempted break-in, he had called his girlfriend. He was panicked, whispering that he was hiding, that police were chasing him, and he didn't say much more. Then the call ended, and she never heard from him again. For days, he was missing. His girlfriend reported the call to authorities and a search effort was launched. Deputies combed the neighborhood and the wild terrain surrounding it, dense woods, brush, and water. Canals and swampy retention ponds crisscrossed the outskirts of Barefoot Bay, making it very difficult to search through thoroughly. Still, nothing turned up. Matthew had simply vanished.
10 days later, on November 23rd, a sharp, nauseating stench began to rise over a small lake near the neighborhood. It drifted into nearby homes and drew the attention of the locals. Law enforcement would respond, and as they approached the edge of the water, they saw vultures circling above. What they found would haunt everyone present. In the shallows, tangled in reeds and brush, was a badly decomposed human body. The scene was grotesque. The remains were bloated, the skin blistered and blackened. The face had decomposed so extensively that it was nearly unrecognizable. The lips were gone and the skin had slipped from one side of the jaw, revealing exposed bone and missing teeth. The lower half of the body had been mutilated beyond recognition. One leg was twisted backward unnaturally, and the other had been stripped to the bone. Chunks of thigh and calf muscle were missing, and what remained of his foot was little more than cartilage and shredded tissue. The abdomen was gashed wide open with deep, ragged tears that exposed intestines and part of the spine. The torso bore dozens of deep puncture wounds, many of which were inflicted while he was still alive, as confirmed later by autopsy. The body was nude from the waist down, except for a single piece of torn fabric clinging to one ankle. One arm was curled behind him, the other splayed out, fingers clenched, showing signs of a desperate struggle. The fingernails were broken and filled with mud and plant matter. Scratch marks lined the forearms and chest, along with signs of bruising, heavy internal bleeding, and forceful trauma to the ribs, one of which was snapped and bent inward. As I said earlier, the stench was nearly unbearable. Even seasoned officers had gagged. The body had been clearly in the water for several days, with insects and fish feeding on the softer tissue. The eyes were gone, and the remaining skin had started to slough off in strips, revealing yellow fat and swollen, discolored flesh beneath. The body was bagged and transported to the Brevard County Medical Examiner's office, where dental records confirmed it was Matthew Ridgens. After that, an autopsy was performed immediately. What they had found left no doubt: the victim had suffered immensely. See, his injuries were not instantaneous or clean. The medical examiner found that many wounds were inflicted while he was still alive. Massive hemorrhaging had occurred throughout the lower limbs, especially around the femoral artery, which had been ripped open, causing catastrophic blood loss. Deep tears through the muscle, torn ligaments, and shattered joints all suggested a violent death by crushing and shredding, not simple trauma. Worse still, his lungs showed signs of survival during the attack. He had remained conscious for some time, long enough to feel it all, to struggle, to drown in pain and confusion before his body finally gave out. Matthew's final moments were spent alone, injured, terrified, and being violently destroyed by something he could not fight off. Somewhere deep in the dark, where no one could hear him scream. As investigators pieced together the evidence, one theory quickly became dominant and would later be confirmed. Based on the condition of the body, the location, and the pattern of injuries, it was determined that Matthew Ridgens had been attacked and killed by an alligator while hiding from deputies. But since they didn't 100% know that it was an alligator, wildlife officers from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission were called in to investigate. A short time later, a large, aggressive 11-foot alligator was captured in the same body of water, and when examined, human remains were found in its stomach, including body parts that matched those missing from Matthew's corpse. After that was found out, obviously the alligator was killed. It was an early evening on a warm July day in rural Leicestershire. The light was golden and low, spilling across the fields like honey. The narrow walking paths that wound through this area were familiar to 29-year-old Rebecca Morris, known to most as Becky. She had grown up nearby, and this route was well-worn, peaceful, and quiet. Nothing that suggested danger or uncertainty, so she decided to take her dog, a small chihuahua named Zero, out for a walk along these country paths. Now, it's not unusual for her to venture out alone. I mean, Becky was independent and very confident, and like I said earlier, this place was quiet and peaceful. But that evening, as she was walking, she took out her phone and snapped a picture. In the photo were several cows grazing in the fading light. She texted the image to her mother along with a playful caption, just one word: cows, C-O-Z. It was a lighthearted moment, nothing more than Becky being Becky. The message was sent at around 9 p.m. And after that, she went silent. Her mother, who had received the picture and tried to reply, became concerned when there was no answer, because Becky was the type of person to answer insanely fast. But when the messages went unanswered and the calls rang out with no reply, it just didn't sit right. And when minutes turned to nearly an hour, worry began to settle in. With growing dread, her parents retraced her route, following the location of the photos she had sent. Eventually, they made their way into the very field where she had taken the picture. There, they found her lying in the grass. She was on her back and motionless. Her dog was nearby, still on the lead but whimpering. The scene was eerily quiet. There were no obvious threats and no signs of any struggle, but Becky's body had told a different story. Emergency responders arrived soon after. The first to attempt CPR were family members, followed quickly by a local paramedic and a nearby farmer who had been called to the site. Her skin was pale, her breathing had stopped, and paramedics worked frantically to restart her heart using chest compressions and ventilation equipment. For a brief moment, they were able to restart her pulse, but it just didn't hold. A second cardiac arrest had followed, and by 11:21 p.m., she was pronounced dead at the scene. What followed was a forensic examination that revealed something far more disturbing than anyone had realized. Her clothing had visible signs of impact, dirt smeared across her chest and side. Her torso showed massive internal bruising. There were blunt force injuries to the left shoulder and the upper chest, where the skin had been torn in a wide downward angle. She had a deep laceration and heavy swelling under the skin, alongside abrasions that followed the arc and dimensions of a hoof. The injury to her liver was catastrophic. It had ruptured internally, torn nearly in half by the pressure of something heavy and forceful. She had bled heavily into her abdomen cavity so much that it caused her heart to stop. Her ribs were intact, but the internal injuries told a story that was both sudden and violent. But there was no defensive trauma, no attempt to run or crawl away. Just a crushing impact and a surge of internal bleeding and collapse. Her death was fast, but not instant, and the moments after the blow, while still conscious, her heart would have been racing. She might have gasped, confused by the shock and pain. The sudden pressure in her abdomen, the tearing inside her core, would have made it impossible to stand. She fell, likely trying to catch her breath, as the internal bleeding progressed beyond recovery, and within minutes, her body was failing. Alone in the field, she faded, while her dog sitting beside her the entire time. What was weird was there was no cuts or puncture wounds from tools, no sign of attack from another person, and no signs that the dog had even been harmed. It definitely wasn't a human act, and the marks weren't random. They were round, hard, and wide. A hoof, one powerful enough to collapse the structure of her body without leaving a single outward fracture. What likely happened in her final moments was both chilling and unordinary. She must have stepped just a little too close to the herd of cows, and when protecting calves are startled by sudden movements, are known to become aggressive. One may have turned quickly, felt threatened by her presence, or that of her dog, and responded with a single devastating strike. It may not have looked like much to an onlooker, a shift in stance, a startled shuffle, but the result was fatal. The animal may not have chased or continued the attack. In fact, none of the animals nearby showed signs of agitation when the others arrived. There was no stampede, no chaos, just the kind of quiet aftermath that leaves no clues until the autopsy begins. But to her family, it just didn't make sense at first. Becky loved animals, and she wasn't reckless. But that didn't matter. A herd of cows outweighs a human tenfold. Their behavior, even when not aggressive, can still be dangerously unpredictable. The tragic truth is that she likely didn't realize the risk, and she probably didn't even feel afraid. Now, there were signs marking public footpaths near the area, but there had been no warning signs or fencing strong enough to keep livestock from approaching or intersecting those paths. It had been a casual evening walking, a smiling text, a photo sent seconds before her final breath. The contrast between how ordinary her day began and how violently it ended was haunting. After her death, the field was changed, fencing was installed, and policies were reviewed. The sun was beginning to dip behind the homes in University City, Missouri, casting long shadows across a quiet residential job site. It was August 2017, and the day had dragged on. It was very hot, exhausting, and slow. On the roof of one house, two men worked in rhythm, a father and his son. They had been laying down shingles, sealing underlayments, and clearing debris for hours, and it was almost time to wrap it up. Aaron Madden, the younger of the two, looked over at his father and suggested they call it a day. Everyone was tired and most of the heavy lifting was done. But his father, Danny Madden, shook his head. There was still a few pieces left to finish and he didn't want to leave the job half done. So without hesitation, he climbed back up the ladder one last time. So after he climbed up and moments later, Danny reached the edge of the roof with a piece of scrap in his hand, something minor like a strip of torn roofing, felt, or broken shingle. He turned toward the ground, leaned slightly to toss it, and in one misstep, everything changed. His foot slipped, and he lost his balance. And then, in a horrifying moment that seemed to literally freeze in time, he fell backward off the roof, arms flailing, legs scrambling to find ground that wasn't there. But directly beneath him was a large open kettle filled with boiling roofing tar, heated to nearly 600 degrees Fahrenheit. These kettles are common on commercial roofing jobs, used to melt and apply asphalt-based material, and on that day it had been opened, bubbling and deadly. And unfortunately, Danny came down back first. The impact, well, was immediate. A sickening hiss as his body hit the surface. The thick, molten tar surged up and around him like black glue, but this glue was nearly as hot as lava. His lower body sank into it and the chemical reaction began on contact. This wasn't just a burn, it was a full body assault. The tar adhered to his skin instantly, melting through his clothes and into his flesh. It didn't just scorch the surface, no, it fused with his tissue, continuing to burn deeper every second. The tar melted his skin and liquefied fat and sizzled through layers of muscle, and in some areas it burned straight to the bone. Danny obviously began screaming, guttural, primal sounds of agony. The pain was literally unimaginable. Tar doesn't just wipe away, it clings, seeps in, and holds on. And the more he moved, the deeper it embedded into him. Aaron ran, another worker joined him, both sprinted to the kettle and tried to pull Danny out. But by grabbing and mint-grabbing tar, which is basically sticky molten asphalt that tore skin from their gloves, and ripped Danny's tissue as they pulled. Flesh stuck to the metal lip of the kettle. That's how hot it was. Pieces of Danny's back and thighs quite literally came off as they dragged him free. They laid him out on the ground and Aaron began cutting away what was left of his clothing. But the fabric had fused into his skin and his body was blackened and raw, skin blistered and bubbling, muscle tissue visible in gory red patches and blood oozing around the seams where burned flesh met tar-covered wounds. The smell was just absolutely disgusting. Burnt flesh, chemical fumes, and roofing material mingled in the air. But somehow Danny was still alive. He moaned, he barely was able to speak. His mouth opened, but words just didn't come out. Just breath, panic, and pain. Steam rose off of him, and his skin in places looked gray and split, like meat seared far past done. Other areas bled openly, and his eyes were wild with confusion and terror. Paramedics would arrive quickly. Even they, with years of trauma experience, would later say it was one of the worst injuries they had ever witnessed. Danny was burned over more than half of his body, and most were third-degree burns, but many were worse, fourth-degree burns, where the burn passes through the skin and fat and destroys the muscle beneath. He was sedated, intubated, and rushed to a burn unit, where doctors worked frantically. But the damage was catastrophic and his body went into shock. They tried to fix his wounds, scraping off the dead and melted tissue, and prepared skin grafts, but it just wasn't enough. Over the next 6 weeks, Danny underwent multiple surgeries where machines breathed for him and he was submerged in medical baths, wrapped in sterile bandages, and kept on heavy painkillers to keep him unconscious. But his kidneys failed and the infection spread through his bloodstream, and his body began shutting down, with him drifting in and out of awareness, never fully waking up and never healing. Eventually, his organs gave out entirely. After 6 excruciating weeks, Danny would die. His official cause of death was multi-organ failure from thermal injuries. But in truth, the moment he fell into that vat, there was no real hope. The rest was just suffering, surgery, pain, and waiting. Aaron Madden was left with scars, physical and psychological. I mean, he had just watched his father fall, watched his body being pulled apart by boiling tar, and heard the sounds of his father screaming in pain and agony. The kettle was obviously moved and the job finished by another crew, but nothing erased that memory.
Your patronage, and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.